White police officer confronts black judge. Claims he stole the car he was driving. What starts as a quiet afternoon in an upscale neighborhood quickly turns into a scene of tension and misunderstanding. A black judge is accused of stealing the very car he owns. But this isn't just a story about a traffic stop. This is a story about prejudice, power, and one man's fight to uncover a system's darkest secrets. Join us as we dive into a gripping tale of courage, justice, and the determination to create change. This is more than just a personal ordeal. It's a stand against systemic corruption and a call for hope in the face of injustice. If you believe in the power of truth and justice, don't forget to hit that subscribe button to join our community. Together, we can shine a light on stories that matter and inspire change. Like, share, and let this message reach as many people as possible. Now, let's step into this powerful story together. The late afternoon sun cast a golden glow over the pristine streets of Crestwood Heights. Judge Marcus Blake let out a contented sigh as his sleek black Tesla hummed smoothly along the boulevard. The quiet purr of the engine harmonized with the soulful rhythm of a Motown classic playing softly from the speakers. This was his moment of solace, a brief escape from the pressures of the courtroom where every decision carried weight and consequence. For Marcus, this drive wasn't just about getting home. It was a reminder of how far he had come. The Tesla was more than a car, it was a symbol of his hard-earned success. A nod to the sacrifices made by his parents and the long hours he had poured into his career. He adjusted his tie absent-mindedly, savoring the still new leather scent of the vehicle and the satisfying knowledge that he had truly earned this life. The houses on either side of the street stood like sentinels of privilege, their manicured lawns and towering facades exuding quiet wealth. Marcus had worked tirelessly to achieve his place among them. Yet, even as he took in the familiar surroundings, a small voice at the back of his mind whispered a reminder he tried to ignore. Not everyone sees you as belonging here. His thoughts were interrupted by a sudden flash of red and blue lights in the rearview mirror. The shrill wail of a siren followed, cutting through the peaceful melody on the radio. Marcus felt his chest tighten as he instinctively glanced at his speedometer. He was well under the limit. He had signaled every turn. What could this possibly be about? Pulling over to the side of the road, Marcus's hands gripped the steering wheel tighter than necessary. The leather creaked under his palms, a stark contrast to the mounting tension in his chest. Through the side mirror, he saw the officer exit her cruiser, her posture rigid, her hand resting on her holstered weapon. His heart sank. The officer, a young woman with angular features and an air of authority, approached the Tesla with measured steps. She didn't hesitate as she gestured for him to lower the window. "License and registration," she demanded, her voice sharp and clipped, devoid of any warmth. Marcus swallowed, his mind racing. This wasn't his first encounter with law enforcement, but the undercurrent of hostility in her tone made his pulse quicken. He forced himself to remain calm, reaching slowly for his wallet. "Of course, officer," he replied, his voice even, "but may I ask why I'm being stopped?" Her eyes narrowed as she took the documents from his hand. She didn't answer immediately, instead scrutinizing his license with a look that seemed designed to question its authenticity. "This vehicle matches the description of one reported stolen last week," she said curtly, her gaze flicking between the license and Marcus. "Step out of the vehicle." "Sir." Marcus's stomach tightened. "Stolen?" he repeated, incredulous. "Officer, there must be a mistake. This is my car. My name is Marcus Blake, and I live just a few blocks from here." Her expression didn't soften. If anything, it grew colder. "Step out of the vehicle," she ordered again, her hand now resting firmly on her holster. The words hit him like a punch to the gut. Marcus hesitated, a whirlwind of emotions swirling inside him. Was this really happening? He was a federal judge. For God's sake, a man whose entire career was dedicated to upholding the law. And yet, here he was, being treated like a suspect. A glance at the nearby houses revealed curtains twitching, faces peering out from behind windows. His neighbors, people who had smiled and waved at him just days ago, were now spectators to his humiliation. Shame burned in his chest, mingling with a growing sense of anger. He unbuckled his seatbelt and stepped out of the car, the sound of his shoes crunching on the gravel unnervingly loud in the stillness. The officer pointed to the hood of his Tesla. "Hands on the car," she said, her voice leaving no room for argument. Marcus complied, pressing his palms against the cool metal surface. The sharp scent of the car's polish mixed with the faint tang of his own sweat. "This is unnecessary," he said, his voice tight but controlled. "I've done nothing wrong." The officer began patting him down, her movements rough and impersonal. "We've had reports of car thefts in this area," she said, her words clipped and mechanical. "Your vehicle matches the description of one that was stolen." Marcus clenched his jaw, willing himself to stay composed. "Officer," he said, his voice carefully measured, "I'm Judge Marcus Blake. This car is legally mine. And if you check the registration, you'll see that." She paused, her hand hovering over her holstered weapon. A scoff escaped her lips. "A judge? Huh, that's a new one." Her tone was laced with skepticism as she reached for her handcuffs. "Save it for the station." Marcus's heart pounded, a cocktail of fear and frustration flooding his veins. But he steadied himself, drawing on the same inner resolve that had carried him through countless trials and injustices. He took a slow, deliberate breath before speaking. "Before you do something you'll regret," he said, his voice calm but firm. "I suggest you call your supervisor. They'll want to know you're about to arrest a federal judge without cause." The officer froze, her expression faltering for the first time. There was a flicker of doubt in her eyes. And Marcus seized the moment. "Call your supervisor," he repeated, his gaze unwavering. She hesitated, then reluctantly reached for her radio. "Dispatch. This is Officer Collins. I need a supervisor at my location," she said, her voice betraying a trace of uncertainty. The next few minutes stretched into what felt like an eternity. Marcus stood there, his hands still on the hood of his car, feeling the weight of every judgmental stare from the houses around him. This wasn't just about the car or the stop, it was about dignity, identity, and the ever-present question of whether his success could ever truly shield him from bias. Finally, a second cruiser arrived. A tall, gray-haired man stepped out, his expression a mix of authority and concern. "What's going on here, Collins?" he asked, his tone sharp. She straightened, though her voice wavered slightly as she explained. "Sir, I stopped this vehicle because it matches the description of a stolen car." The man turned to Marcus, his gaze narrowing before softening with recognition. "Judge Blake," he said, his tone immediately deferential, "I am so sorry for this misunderstanding." "Misunderstanding," Marcus echoed, the word heavy with unspoken meaning. His jaw tightened as he straightened his jacket. "That's one way to frame it." The officer's face reddened as her superior dismissed her and apologized profusely. But Marcus's mind was already racing. This wasn't just an insult to him, it was a symptom of something much larger. And as he looked around at the watching faces, Marcus made a silent vow. He wouldn't let this incident end here. Marcus Blake sat at his kitchen table, staring at the untouched cup of coffee in front of him. The events of the previous day replayed in his mind like a haunting refrain. The cold steel of the car's hood, the officer's accusatory tone, the silent judgment of his neighbors, it all lingered, refusing to dissipate. Vanessa, his wife, moved quietly around the kitchen. Stealing glances at him, she placed a hand on his shoulder, a comforting gesture that felt heavy with unspoken concern. "You didn't sleep, did you?" she asked softly. He shook his head, rubbing his temples. "How could I? Yesterday wasn't just a bad day. It was a reminder of something I've tried to ignore for too long." He glanced at her, his voice hardening. "It's not enough that I've worked my entire life to reach this point. To them, I'll always just be another black man in a nice car." Vanessa nodded, her face a mix of anger and empathy. "Marcus, you have every right to be furious. What they did wasn't just unprofessional, it was dehumanizing." She hesitated before continuing, "But you're also not the type to let this go." He leaned back in his chair, exhaling sharply. "No, I'm not. This isn't just about me, Vanessa. It's about everyone who's been humiliated, wrongly accused, or worse. And it's about the people in power who allow this to happen." Before she could respond, his phone buzzed on the table, breaking the silence. Marcus picked it up, his brow furrowing as he read the message. "Drop it, Judge. Some fights aren't worth starting." The words sent a chill down his spine. The number was unlisted, and the tone was unmistakable. This wasn't a warning, it was a threat. He showed the text to Vanessa, who immediately stiffened. "This isn't random," she said, her voice laced with urgency. "They're trying to intimidate you." Marcus set the phone down deliberately. "Whoever sent that knows I'm not going to back down. And they're scared of what I might uncover." Vanessa folded her arms, her eyes narrowing. "You think this has to do with your rulings?" He nodded. "It has to. I've made some enemies over the years, developers, businesses, even some officials, people who see me as an obstacle." He paused, his mind racing. That traffic stop wasn't a coincidence. Someone wanted to send a message. Vanessa took a deep breath, her concern deepening. "Marcus, this isn't just about proving a point anymore. This could be dangerous." He reached out and took her hand. "I know, but I can't ignore this. Not after what happened yesterday." Later that day, Marcus sat in his office, sifting through his case files. Each folder represented a ruling he had made, some of which had disrupted powerful interests. One case stood out, a recent decision against a company called Ridgeway Holdings. They'd been fined millions for environmental violations, and Marcus's ruling had effectively halted their latest development project. The CEO, David Lanning, had been openly hostile in court, vowing to make things right. As he pored over the details, his phone rang. The name on the screen brought a brief moment of relief: Detective Eric Saunders. Eric was not only a trusted ally but also a close friend from Marcus's law school days. "Eric," Marcus said, answering the call, "I was just thinking about you." "Marcus." Eric's voice was steady but serious. "I heard about what happened yesterday. Are you okay?" Marcus hesitated. "I'm fine, but it's more complicated than it looks." "I figured as much," Eric said. "That's why I called. I think we need to talk, off the record. There's something you need to know." "What is it?" Marcus asked, his grip tightening on the phone. "Not over the phone," Eric replied. "Can you meet me tonight? There's a diner near the precinct, Frank's. Let's say 8 o'clock. I'll be there," Marcus said, a knot forming in his stomach. Whatever Eric had to share, it wasn't good. That evening, Marcus arrived at Frank's diner. A modest establishment tucked between two high-rise buildings. The place was quiet, save for the clinking of dishes and the soft murmur of conversations. Eric sat in a corner booth, a steaming cup of coffee in front of him. "Thanks for coming," Eric said as Marcus slid into the seat across from him. "I didn't have much choice," Marcus replied, his tone wry. "You sounded serious." Eric leaned forward, his expression grim. "That officer who pulled you over yesterday, Collins, she didn't stop you by accident." Marcus's heart sank. "Go on. I've been hearing whispers around the precinct," Eric said, lowering his voice. "There's a group of officers working under the radar, taking orders from people outside the department. Developers, business owners, even some politicians. They're using the force to harass, intimidate, and silence anyone who gets in their way." Marcus's jaw tightened. "And you think I'm their latest target?" Eric nodded. "I know you've made some powerful enemies in court, Marcus. People who don't like being told no. That stop yesterday, it was meant to rattle you, make you think twice before crossing him again." Marcus sat back, his mind racing. The text message, the traffic stop, it all made sense now. "Do you have proof?" "Not yet," Eric admitted, "but I'm working on it. And I'm not the only one. There are officers who see what's happening and want to fight back. But it's dangerous, Marcus. These people play dirty, and they have no problem going after family or friends." The weight of Eric's words settled heavily on Marcus's shoulders. He had spent his entire career fighting for justice. But this was something else, a battle against an unseen enemy willing to bend the law to serve their own interests. "Thanks for telling me," Marcus said finally, "but I can't back down. If anything, this just makes me more determined." Eric gave him a long, searching look. "I figured you'd say that. Just promise me you'll be careful. This isn't a courtroom, Marcus. Out here, the rules are different." As Marcus left the diner, the cool night air did little to clear his mind. The stakes were higher than he had realized, and the lines between justice and survival were beginning to blur. But one thing was clear: he couldn't face this alone, and he couldn't let fear dictate his next move. As he walked to his car, his phone buzzed again, another message from the unlisted number. "This is your last warning, Blake. Don't make us prove we're serious." Marcus stared at the screen, his resolve hardening. Whoever they were, they'd made one critical mistake. They underestimated just how far he was willing to go for the truth. This fight wasn't just his anymore. It was for everyone who had been silenced, dismissed, or ignored, and he was just getting started. The next morning, Marcus Blake woke to a faint knock on his front door. His thoughts, already clouded by the weight of the last few days, sharpened as he glanced at the clock. It was barely 7 a.m. The knock came again, insistent yet cautious. Marcus grabbed a robe and padded to the door, his nerves on edge. Through the peephole, he saw a young man in plain clothes shifting nervously, holding a brown envelope. Marcus opened the door a crack. "Can I help you?" he asked, his voice firm. "Judge Blake?" the man asked, glancing around as though someone might be watching. When Marcus nodded, the man quickly handed him the envelope. "You'll want to see this. But be careful who you trust." Without waiting for a response, the man turned and walked briskly down the driveway, disappearing around the corner. Marcus stared at the envelope in his hands, its weight far heavier than the paper it contained. He closed the door, securing the locks behind him, and sat down at the dining table. Vanessa entered the room, still in her pajamas, her face etched with concern. "What's that?" she asked, pouring herself a cup of coffee. "I'm not sure," Marcus replied, opening the envelope. Inside were several grainy photographs and a handwritten note. The photos showed men in uniform, police officers, sitting in what appeared to be a private meeting room. Among them was Officer Collins, the woman who had stopped him, along with a man Marcus recognized from news reports, David Lanning, CEO of Ridgeway Holdings. Lanning was leaning over the table, pointing to a map, while the officers looked on. The note was brief. "This is just the beginning. Lanning's reach is deep. Stay vigilant." Marcus leaned back, his mind racing. The photographs confirmed what Eric had told him the night before. There was a coordinated effort involving corrupt officers and powerful figures like Lanning. The map in the photo suggested they were planning something. But what? Vanessa sat down beside him, reading the note over his shoulder. "Marcus, this is serious. You need to go to someone, Eric. The press. Anyone who can help." Marcus shook his head. "If I take this to the wrong person, it'll disappear, and I'll have a target on my back. Whoever sent this is trying to help. But they're also warning me. I can't act rashly." Vanessa reached for his hand. "Then what's the plan?" Marcus exhaled slowly. "I need to dig deeper. If I can expose this, we might be able to stop whatever Lanning is planning, and bring down this network of corruption." By mid-morning, Marcus had arranged a meeting with Eric Saunders at an unassuming coffee shop downtown. The detective was already seated when Marcus arrived, nursing a cup of black coffee and scanning the room with a practiced eye. Marcus slid into the seat across from him and placed the envelope on the table. "Someone dropped this off at my house this morning." Eric opened the envelope and studied its contents, his expression darkening. "Lanning," he muttered, shaking his head. "I've suspected he was involved in something like this. But seeing it, it's worse than I thought." Marcus leaned forward. "What's his endgame? These aren't random meetings." Eric rubbed his temples. "Ridgeway Holdings has been trying to expand its reach into city projects, construction contracts, zoning changes. You name it. Lanning wants control, and he's using the police to pressure officials, intimidate activists, and clear the way for his operations. Your ruling against Ridgeway, that wasn't just a financial loss for him, it was a public embarrassment. And now he's trying to silence me," Marcus said, his voice laced with determination. Eric nodded grimly. "If he succeeds, it'll send a message. No one is untouchable." The conversation was interrupted by the arrival of a waitress, who set down a fresh cup of coffee in front of Marcus. He thanked her, waiting until she was out of earshot before continuing. "How do we stop this? We need more than photographs. We need evidence that ties Lanning directly to these officers, and whatever illegal activities they're involved in." Eric hesitated before speaking. "There's a safe house," he said finally. "It's where they hold their private meetings. If we can get inside, we might find what we need: documents, recordings, something irrefutable." "And how do we get in?" Marcus asked. "That's the hard part," Eric admitted. "The place is guarded, and access is limited to a few trusted people. But I have a lead, an officer who might be willing to talk. Her name's Officer Ramirez. She's clean, but she's seen enough to know something's wrong. I can reach out to her, but it'll take time." Marcus nodded, his mind already working through the possibilities. "Do it. The sooner we get that evidence, the better." That evening, as Marcus returned home, the tension of the day weighed heavily on him. He parked the Tesla in the driveway, his eyes scanning the quiet street for anything unusual. The neighborhood seemed unchanged, but he couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. Inside, Vanessa greeted him with a worried smile. "You've been out all day. Did you make any progress?" "Some," Marcus replied. setting his briefcase on the kitchen counter. He explained his meeting with Eric and the plan to contact Officer Ramirez. Vanessa listened intently, then placed a hand on his arm. "Marcus, I'm proud of you for standing up to this. But I'm scared. These people don't play by the rules." "I know," Marcus said, his voice softer now, "but if we don't fight back, they'll keep getting away with it. And more people will suffer." Before Vanessa could respond, a loud crash sounded from the front porch. Both of them froze. Marcus moved to the window and peered outside. A brick lay on the porch, its surface wrapped in a piece of paper. He opened the door cautiously. Retrieving the object, unwrapping the paper, he found a simple, chilling message scrawled in bold letters. "This is your final warning. Drop it." Marcus felt a cold wave of anger rise in his chest. He turned to Vanessa, his jaw clenched. "They're trying to scare us." Vanessa's eyes filled with fear, but she stood her ground. "Then don't let them, whatever they're hiding, Marcus. It's worth exposing." Marcus nodded, his resolve hardening. The threats only confirmed what he already knew: he was on the right track. And no matter how dangerous the path ahead might be, he wasn't about to turn back now. The shadows of corruption were closing in. But Marcus was ready to shine a light. The next morning, Marcus sat in his office, the sunlight streaming through the windows failing to warm the cold resolve in his chest. He stared at the brick from the night before, now resting on his desk, as though it might somehow yield answers. The message it carried was clear: stop digging, or face the consequences. But Marcus wasn't one to be easily deterred. If anything, the threat only strengthened his resolve. A sharp knock at the door broke his thoughts. It was Vanessa, holding his phone. "It's Eric," she said, her voice laced with concern. "He says it's urgent." Marcus took the phone, nodding to her as she retreated. "Eric, what's going on?" "I spoke to Ramirez," Eric said without preamble. "She's willing to meet, but she's scared. Lanning's people are everywhere, and she's worried about being followed. We'll have to do this quietly." "Where and when?" Marcus asked, already reaching for his coat. "Tonight, 9 p.m. There's an abandoned warehouse on the edge of town. Used to be a freight depot. She picked it because it's out of the way. But it's risky. If anyone sees us there, it could blow her cover." Marcus frowned. "Do you trust her? She's one of the good ones," Eric said, "but she's walking a fine line. If we don't handle this right, it could cost her everything." "Understood," Marcus replied. "I'll be there." The hours ticked by slowly, the weight of anticipation pressing on Marcus as he prepared for the meeting. Vanessa watched him quietly, her eyes filled with unspoken worry. "Promise me you'll be careful," she said softly. "I will," Marcus assured her, "but we can't wait any longer. If Ramirez has information, it could be the breakthrough we need." As the clock approached 9, Marcus parked his car a few blocks away from the warehouse and walked the rest of the way, keeping to the shadows. The air was cold and still, the faint hum of distant traffic the only sound. The warehouse loomed ahead, its broken windows and rusted doors a testament to years of neglect. Inside, the dim light of a single bulb illuminated Eric and a woman in a police jacket, Officer Ramirez. She looked up as Marcus entered, her expression a mixture of determination and fear. "Judge Blake," she said, extending a hand. "Thank you for coming. Thank you for meeting us." Marcus replied, shaking her hand. "Eric says you have information that could help us." Ramirez nodded, glancing around nervously. "I don't have much time. If anyone finds out I'm here." She trailed off, then pulled a small USB drive from her pocket. "This is everything I could get without raising suspicion. Rosters, meeting notes, Surveillance reports, it's all tied to Lanning and his group. They're using officers to clear the way for Ridgway's projects, intimidating residents, burying complaints, falsifying reports. Marcus took the drive, his grip tightening around it. This is exactly what we need. Thank you. There's more, Ramirez added, her voice lowering. I overheard something last week. Lanning's planning a major operation. I don't know all the details, but it's big, and it's happening soon. Whatever he's doing, it's not just about money, it's about control. Before Marcus could respond, a sudden noise echoed through the warehouse, a metallic clang, like a door being forced open. Ramirez froze, her eyes widening in fear. Did you tell anyone else you'd be here? She whispered. Eric shook his head, his hand instinctively moving toward his holster. Stay quiet, he said, his voice barely audible. Footsteps approached, heavy and deliberate. Marcus's pulse quickened as a shadow moved across the far wall. A man stepped into the light, a tall figure in a dark suit, flanked by two uniformed officers. Well, the man said, his voice dripping with smugness. Judge Blake, Detective Saunders, and Officer Ramirez. What an interesting little meeting. It was David Lanning. The air in the warehouse grew electric with tension as Lanning stepped closer, his cold eyes fixed on Marcus. You're persistent, Judge, he said, a thin smile playing on his lips. I'll give you that, but persistence can be dangerous when you don't know who you're dealing with. Eric stepped forward, his stance protective. You're out of your jurisdiction, Lanning. This isn't your playground. Lanning chuckled. Oh, but it is. You see, I don't just own construction companies, I own people. And those people don't appreciate meddling. His gaze shifted to Ramirez, who stood rigid, her hand twitching near her sidearm. Officer Ramirez, Lanning continued, his tone mockingly polite. You've been quite the disappointment. Loyalty isn't what it used to be. Is it? Leave her out of this. Marcus interjected, his voice steady despite the fear gnawing at him. You want to threaten someone? Threaten me. Lanning's smile faded, replaced by a look of disdain. You think you're some kind of hero, don't you? But heroes don't last long in my world. Judge. He nodded to the officers behind him. Confiscate their phones. Search them. Eric moved to block the advancing officers, his hand on his holster. Don't even think about it. The tension reached a boiling point as both sides stared each other down. Ramirez, her voice trembling but resolute, broke the silence. I won't let you get away with this. Lanning, you can't control everyone. Lanning laughed, a cruel sound that echoed off the warehouse walls. That's where you're wrong, officer. I don't need to control everyone, just enough to keep people like you in check. But as he spoke, Marcus's mind raced. He still had the USB drive hidden in his pocket. The evidence was within reach, but getting it out of the warehouse seemed impossible. Then, an idea struck him, a risky, desperate gamble. Lanning, Marcus said, stepping forward, his voice calm but firm. You think you've won, but you've already lost. The truth always comes out. Lanning's eyes narrowed. Big words for a man in your position. Marcus met his gaze, unflinching. We'll see. At that moment, the distant wail of sirens broke through the tense silence. Ramirez's face lit up with realization. Back up, she whispered. Eric must have called it in. Lanning's expression darkened, and he gestured sharply to his men. We're done here, let's go. As the officers retreated with Lanning, Marcus felt a surge of relief tempered by the knowledge that the fight was far from over. He looked at Eric and Ramirez. We need to move fast. This drive might be the key to taking him down. Ramirez nodded, determination replacing her fear. Then let's make it count. The battle lines were drawn, and the stakes had never been higher. Marcus knew the road ahead would be fraught with danger, but he also knew one thing with absolute certainty: the truth was worth fighting for. The air in Marcus Blake's office was heavy with tension as the USB drive uploaded its contents onto Eric Saunders' laptop. Ramirez stood near the window, her eyes scanning the quiet street below for any signs of trouble. Vanessa hovered nearby, her face pale but resolute. "Almost there," Eric said, his voice tense. The screen filled with rows of documents, audio recordings, and surveillance logs. The evidence was damning: detailed records of bribes, forged permits, and a clear chain of command tying David Lanning and Ridgway Holdings to the corrupt officers who enabled his schemes. "This is it," Eric said, leaning back. "This is everything we need to bring Lanning down." "Not just Lanning," Ramirez interjected. "This implicates half the precinct's leadership. They've been covering for him, taking orders, and silencing anyone who got in the way." Marcus nodded, his jaw tight. "This is bigger than any of us. We need to get this into the right hands. Fast." Eric's phone buzzed, and he glanced at the screen. His expression darkened. "It's already started. There's chatter at the station. Someone leaked that Ramirez was seen meeting with me. They know we're onto them." Ramirez turned from the window, her face pale. "We don't have much time. If they know, they'll come after us, and this evidence." Marcus stood, his voice firm. "We need to move. Eric, can you get this to the district attorney?" Eric hesitated. "The DA's office might already be compromised. We can't risk it." Vanessa, who had been silent until now, stepped forward. "What about the media? If this goes public, they won't be able to bury it." Marcus considered her suggestion. It was risky, but it might be their only chance. "Do we know anyone in the press we can trust?" Eric nodded. Channel 8 News. Their investigative reporter, Laura Klein, has been digging into Ridgway for months. If anyone can get this out, it's her. "Then that's our move," Marcus said. "We take this to Laura, and we make it public." The ride to Channel 8 was tense and silent, the air charged with urgency. Marcus drove while Eric and Ramirez kept watch for any signs of pursuit. Vanessa sat beside him, her hand resting on his arm, a steadying presence amid the chaos. As they approached the news station, Eric's phone buzzed again. He glanced at it, then cursed under his breath. "We've got company. 2 unmarked cars. They're tailing us." Marcus's heart pounded, but he forced himself to stay calm. "How far back?" "Close enough to act if they think we're stopping," Eric replied, his hand resting on his holster. Vanessa turned in her seat, her eyes wide. "What do we do?" Marcus tightened his grip on the wheel. "We don't stop. Not until we're inside that station." The unmarked cars followed them into the parking lot, their tinted windows gleaming under the streetlights. As Marcus and the others exited the vehicle, the cars parked abruptly, and 4 men in suits stepped out, their postures threatening. "Judge Blake," one of them called, his voice carrying across the lot. "We just want to talk." Eric stepped forward, his stance protective. "Stay back. You have no authority here." The man smiled coldly. "Authority doesn't matter when you're in the wrong place at the wrong time." Before he could step closer, the glass doors of the news station swung open. A petite woman with sharp eyes and a microphone in hand stepped out, flanked by 2 security guards. "Gentlemen," Laura Klein said, her voice firm, "unless you're here for an interview, I suggest you leave. This is private property, and you're being recorded." The men hesitated, their eyes darting to the security cameras mounted above the entrance. Finally, the leader sneered and gestured to his men to back off. "We'll see you soon, Judge Blake." As they retreated, Marcus turned to Laura. "Thank you. Let's save the thanks for after we've aired this," Laura said, motioning for them to follow. "If what Eric told me is true, we've got a lot of work to do." Inside the newsroom, Marcus handed over the USB drive, explaining its contents in detail. Laura listened intently, her expression hardening with each revelation. "This is explosive," she said finally. "If even half of this is accurate, it'll shake the city to its core." "It's accurate," Ramirez said firmly. "I've seen it firsthand." Laura nodded. "We'll need to verify everything before we air it. But this could go live tonight." Eric stepped forward. "Be careful. Lanning and his people won't sit back and watch this happen. They'll try to stop you." "I'm counting on it," Laura replied, her eyes sharp with determination. "But once this hits the air, they won't be able to stop the fallout." As the broadcast began, Marcus, Vanessa, Eric, and Ramirez watched from a private room in the station. Laura's voice carried through the speakers, calm and authoritative as she laid out the evidence piece by piece. Documents and images flashed across the screen, painting a damning picture of corruption, collusion, and abuse of power. Marcus felt a wave of relief and vindication wash over him. The truth was out, and there was no turning back. But just as Laura was wrapping up, a loud crash echoed through the building. The room fell silent, and Eric immediately drew his weapon. "Stay here," he ordered, motioning for Ramirez to follow him. Marcus stood, his heart pounding. "What's happening?" Vanessa grabbed his arm. "Marcus, don't." Before she could finish, the door burst open, and two armed men stormed in. "Nobody move," one of them barked, aiming his weapon at Marcus. Marcus raised his hands slowly, his mind racing. The men looked desperate, their eyes darting nervously. "You're making a mistake," he said calmly. "It's over. The story is already out." The man hesitated, his grip on the weapon faltering. "Shut up." At that moment, Eric and Ramirez reappeared, their weapons drawn. "Drop it," Eric shouted. The standoff was tense, but the armed men, realizing they were outnumbered and outmaneuvered, finally surrendered. Eric quickly disarmed him as station security rushed in to take control. Hours later, as the first rays of dawn broke over the city, Marcus stood outside the station, breathing in the cool morning air. The broadcast had sparked a firestorm, with calls flooding into the station and officials scrambling to respond. Vanessa joined him, slipping her hand into his. "You did it," she said softly. "We did it," Marcus corrected, his voice filled with gratitude. Eric and Ramirez approached, their expressions a mixture of exhaustion and pride. "The DA's office just issued a statement," Eric said. "Lanning's been taken into custody. Warrants are being issued for the officers involved." "It's a start," Marcus said, his gaze distant. "But the fight isn't over. The system that allowed this to happen is still in place." Ramirez nodded. "One step at a time, Judge." As the city woke to the news of the revelations, Marcus felt a sense of hope tempered by the knowledge of the road ahead. The battle against corruption was far from over, but he knew now more than ever that it was a fight worth waging. And for the first time in days, he allowed himself to believe that justice could prevail. The fight for justice is rarely a straight path, and it's never an easy one. Judge Marcus Blake's story reminds us all that courage, truth, and persistence can shine a light even in the darkest of places. While this chapter of the battle has ended, the journey to reform and accountability continues. This isn't just a story about one man, it's a story about all of us. about standing up when it matters most, about using our voices to demand change, and about believing that justice, no matter how elusive, is always worth fighting for. If Marcus Blake's story resonated with you, if you believe in the power of truth and community, we invite you to join us. Hit that subscribe button below and become part of a growing movement to uncover stories that matter. It's completely free, and it ensures you'll never miss another powerful tale like this one. Together, we can amplify these voices, share these stories, and inspire the change we want to see in the world. Thank you for watching, and we'll see you in the next story.